there's so little reflection in the West of how many people have you killed? How many lives have you destroyed by becoming so trigger happy? But I can tell you that was a mistake that prevented you also from seeing what was happening. And the rest of the world noticed.
欢迎来到胤蓝智库。今天我们要复盘的是新加坡前外交官、地缘政治学者马凯硕的一场破圈演讲。在冷战后的30年里，西方世界沉溺于苏联崛起的狂欢中，自诩为全球秩序的唯一制定者。然而，就在西方精英们沉溺于12%的人口统治世界的幻觉时，世界变了。马凯瑞站在西方艺术节的舞台中央，不仅没有迎合，反而是以一种近乎冒犯的坦诚撕开了西方文明冷战后的心理防线。马凯硕的论点极为艰巨且极具冲击力，他将冷战后的西方定义为一种孤傲的自恋文明。他指出，西方因自负而产生的触发式好战倾向，即通过军事干预强行输出体制，不仅未能建立所谓的自由世界，反而将西方推向了国际道义的对立面。他提出的关键数据是，西方人口仅占全球的 12%， 剩下的 88% 正在觉醒。为什么一个拥有如此深厚底蕴的文明，会在全球化进程中逐渐失去了方向，甚至将曾经的朋友推向对手？这背后到底隐藏着怎样的利益博弈与逻辑错位呢？接下来我们直接进入这场足以改变你对当下世界认知、犀利且冷峻的深度访谈。
Good morning, everyone. This is my first time at the How the Light Gets In festival and my first speech. So you can see I'm very nervous. But anyway, as you know, in the West, especially in Americans and British, you start the talk, you make a joke. I come from Asia, and in Asia we always begin with an apology. But this is actually a genuine apology. And I sincerely want to apologize to you all if my talk makes you feel uncomfortable. And the problem here is that if I don't make you uncomfortable, and if I don't take you out of your comfort zones, you won't understand the world that's coming. The world that is coming is so far outside your comfort zones that you really got to, in a sense, suffer a bit of pain if you're going to understand it. So the way I propose to organize my remarks today is to try and give you a glimpse of the new world that's emerging. And I'll talk in the first part about how we are seeing, firstly, of course, the end of the era of Western domination of world history. The West has had a very good run. 200 years plus of global domination, which was fun. But that's over. And it's important to understand why it's over. What happened? What did the West do wrong? And then the second part about basically what you're seeing is a new multi-civilizational world where you're seeing the return of other civilizations. And that's, of course, going to change the texture and chemistry of our world significantly. And I'm going to focus, although in that section, mostly on China, because China is now the leading edge of a new world. And if you don't understand China, you don't understand new world is coming, right? And then I'm going to talk about what you might see, therefore, as we move into this new world. What kind of scenarios can we expect? How will we stumble into this new world that's coming? So let me then begin by talking about why the West has lost its way. And I want to just begin by making a slightly provocative statement that the West has, in global terms, become a lonely, narcissistic civilization, self-absorbed in itself, very happy with itself. And therefore, with this narcissism, has blinded itself to the mistakes that it has made in dealing with the rest of the world. And I want to begin the story in some ways with the end of the Cold War in 1990. Because I'm sure you all remember how the West celebrated, how happy the West was that it defeated the Soviet Union without firing a shot. And the West thought, hey, we have arrived. And you even believed, this is amazing. Almost everyone in the West believed that you had reached the end of history. Hooray! We don't have to struggle anymore. We've made it. We made it to the top. We've achieved these liberal democratic societies, which are the best societies in the world. We succeeded. We have made it. The rest of you, the rest of the world, you got to struggle. We don't have to struggle. And one statistic that I'm surprised that so few in the West are aware of is that the West only makes up 12% of the world's population. 12%. 88% lives outside the West. And the West crazily assumed at that moment of history, when it reached the end of history, that the rest of the West would come and become replicas of the West. Copy you, follow you, and become like you. I'm sure you'll all agree that that's a somewhat arrogant assumption on the part of the West. But that arrogance dominated the worldview of all the Western intellectuals at that time. I know it so well because by an accident of history, I spent a year in Harvard in 91, 92, and I drowned in that arrogance that I could feel about how the West had arrived and succeeded, and the rest of you poor chaps, get used to it, adjust to it, move on. So the reason why that arrogance at that point was a major strategic mistake, because that arrogance put the West to sleep at precisely the moment when the other civilization decide to wake up. So you close your eyes when the rest of the world was waking up. And remember, China had started its 4 modernizations program in 1979, and by 1989, 1990 was gaining a lot of momentum. And then India also woke up around the early 1990s. As a result of crisis, by the way, in both cases, China went through major crisis and said, okay, enough is enough. Time for us to get sensible and do the right thing. India went through major crisis and said, enough is enough. Let's do the right thing. And of course, what you've seen since then, in the case of the Chinese civilization has been around for 4,000 years. And the last 40 years of economic and social development in China have been the best 40 years in 4,000 years of Chinese history. And the West said, cannot be. They're not like us. They cannot be succeeding. Right? Because you assume to succeed, you must be liberal democratic. So that clearly, that's why I think the end of the history moment was a disastrous moment for the West, because it put the West to sleep at precisely the moment when the West was waking up. But there was another major strategic mistake that the West made once it felt that, okay, we're number one, we can run the world, we can do what we want to do. And of course, many in the West believe that the most peaceful, law-abiding civilization in the world is Western civilization. But if you look at the data, the West became trigger happy and started getting involved in wars after wars. The last 30 over years, the West decided that the best way to spread liberty is to bomb cities. Bombing is the best way to spread democracy and liberalism. And the rest of the world noticed that this happened, that you had become trigger happy. Of course, it started in the late 1990s, when, of course, you thought you were doing the right thing, you're trying to protect the people of the former Yugoslavia, and the way you do that is by bombing Belgrade. And incidentally, curiously, many in the West believe that the West, of course, always abides by international law. The bombing of Belgrade was a violation of international law. International law makes it very clear. This is Western international law. 1945 UN rules-based order, Western international law, that says that the use of force is justified when it's either an act of self-defense or if it's authorized by the UN Security Council. The bombing of Belgrade was not an act of self-defense, not authorized by the UN Security Council, and therefore illegal. And it's interesting because the West always believes in the rule of law. I can tell you, when a Western prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia tried just to say, should we ask the question whether the bombing of Belgrade was legal or illegal, the amount of pressure put on that prosecutor was phenomenal. Again, many in the West didn't notice this, but the rest of the world noticed this. And that, of course, that trigger-happy strain didn't stop at Yugoslavia. It carried on with the Iraq War in 2003. And clearly, that war was illegal. It was not an act of self-defense, not authorized by UN Security Council. And by the way, I know perfectly well it wasn't authorized by the UN Security Council because I was a member of the UN Security Council myself, personally, for 2 years. I watched the debates and I watched whether or not the United States and UK pushing very hard to get the rest of the world to agree the time had come to remove Saddam Hussein. The rest of the world said, no, this is not legal. And by the way, curiously, one interesting thing about the Iraq War that is worth noting and remembering is that two of the best friends of the United States and the United Kingdom, two countries called France and Germany, actually opposed the war and did say to US and UK, this is the mistake, don't do this is the mistake. And of course, they were shoved aside because there was total conviction that what the US was doing in spreading democracy was the right thing. What stunned me, by the way, sometimes little stories that give you an indication of how people think. I thought that this desire for war was probably limited to a tribe that's called the neocons in America, by the way, who always believe that the best solution is American military intervention. But I happened to be in New York in 2002, attending a wonderful lunch in a very exclusive club in New York. And I was sitting next to a very successful American businessman. And as we were sat down for lunch, we were being served wine. And when the waiter came to pour wine, this gentleman asked the waiter, is this French wine? The waiter said, yes. He said, I'm not touching French wine. They're opposing our war in Iraq. That, to me, was a huge wake-up call. Gosh, this desire for war is so deep, so entrenched in the West. But Iraq war, as you know, was not the last war. There could have been lessons learned. War crimes were committed in Iraq. And at the same time, subsequently, when you intervene in Libya, right, that was also a major war crime. I mean, Gaddafi was a dictator. Let's be clear about that. There's no doubt that he was a dictator. But under him, the Libyan people had the best lives of anybody in Africa. They had guaranteed income, guaranteed healthcare, guaranteed education, guaranteed peace. They had good lives. And then you bombed Gaddafi. The country collapsed. The West created a failed state and just walked away. And the rest of the world noticed. So, I mean, there's so little reflection in the West of how many people have you killed? How many lives have you destroyed by becoming so trigger happy after the end of the Cold War? But I can tell you that was a mistake that prevented you also from seeing what was happening. And of course, the third strategic mistake that the West made was to continue to try and dominate the world. I think most ordinary citizens in the West are not aware of what your leaders, what your diplomats are trying to do in trying to preserve Western control of the world. And in often using methods and principles that in theory go against Western principles. Okay? I mean, for example, you believe in meritocracy. You believe that if anyone should be chosen to run an organization, it should be the best possible person. It doesn't matter whether he's white or black or Asian or African. Doesn't matter. If he's the best person, we pick him. Right? Now, two of the world's most important international economic organizations are the IMF and the World Bank. In theory, they serve the world. So anybody in the world should qualify to run the IMF and the World Bank. And I can tell you, at one moment when the West felt very vulnerable, at the height of the 2008 financial crisis, when people in the US and Europe began to think, what's happening to us, what's happening to us? When you suddenly needed the rest of the world to come together to save the world economy, you had a G20 meeting in the UK chaired by Gordon Brown, and you said at that meeting, from now on, the leaders of IMF and the World Bank must be chosen on merit. 2008 is 18 years ago. 18 years have passed. Even now, to become the head of the IMF, you must be a European. To become the head of the World Bank, you must be an American. And 88% of the world's population don't qualify to run a world's institution. Now, that is so unwise. So unwise. These are supposed to be global institutions. Why do you insist that only Westerners can run it? Why do you say only 12% of the world can run the world's institutions? Clearly, these are decisions made by your leaders. And all these decisions will come to haunt you as the world changes now.
看完马凯硕的拆解，我们必须从现象深入到本质。马凯硕所批判的，本质上是西方在后冷战红利期产生的路径依赖。对于西方精英而言，维持二战后确立的国际制度，如 IMF 与世界银行的领导权，不仅是经济利益的博弈，更是维护其文明优越感的核心工具。这种管理权的垄断与全球力量对比的动态演变，发生了严重结构性的错位。当我们看到中国等西方文明在过去40年里通过工业化的积累实现了历史性的崛起时，这种力量对比的改变让西方的舒适区变得极其脆弱。马凯硕提到的西方的傲慢本质上是一种无法适应多文明世界的回归心理滞后，这种心理滞后导致了决策层面的连续错误，规则的选择性使用，对军事 干预的路径依赖，以及对发展中国家诉求的漠视。历史从来不是线性的，更不存在所谓的增减。马凯硕的忠告其实是对当前全球地缘政治危机的一种警钟。一个文明的衰落往往不是从外部打击开始的，而是从内部失去对真实世界的观察能力开始的。当傲慢成为认知的障碍，孤独便成为必然的结果。未来世界的基本盘将是一个多文明协同、竞争与共存的格局。对于西方而言，最大的考验并非如何维护现有的霸权，而是能否学会与占全球 88% 的人口在不同文明逻辑下运行的群体达成真正的平等对话。历史的齿轮已经转动，旧有的舒适区正在崩塌。你认为西方精英能否跳出固有的文明优越感，真正接受一个多元且多极化的世界呢？或者说，这种边缘化的趋势是否可以逆转呢？欢迎在评论区留下你基于逻辑的深度洞察。这里是胤蓝智库，关注我们一起在乱局中看清历史的脉络。我们下期见。